Ezekiel sits by the Chebar Canal, an exile in Babylon. When the sky peels back, out of a whirlwind comes a terrifying sight. 4 living creatures with faces of lions, oxen, eagles, and men, their wings clashing like thunder. Beside them are wheels within wheels, rimmed with eyes, moving with lightning speed. High above, on a throne of sapphire, sits a figure like glowing metal, the overwhelming glory of God. God speaks, but not with a simple greeting. He hands Ezekiel a scroll covered in lament, mourning, and woe, the command, "Eat it." Strangely, the words of judgment taste as sweet as honey in his mouth. Ezekiel is then sent to a stubborn, hard-headed people. He is appointed as a watchman. If he fails to warn them of coming danger, their blood is on his hands. If he speaks and they ignore him, he is innocent. The prophet is then led into a heavy silence, bound in his house, becoming a living sign of the gravity of the divine word. Ezekiel is no longer just a voice. He is a living, breathing parable. God commands him to take a clay tablet and sketch a miniature Jerusalem, then build tiny siege ramps around it. For 430 days, the prophet lies bound on his side, a human statue representing the years of rebellion by Israel and Judah. His diet is a grim forecast, bread baked over dung, a sign of the starvation and unclean life awaiting the exiles. Then comes the razor. Ezekiel shaves his head and beard, weighing the hair in scales. 1/3 is burned, 1/3 is struck with a sword, and 1/3 is scattered to the wind. It is a chilling infographic of death and displacement. Yet, in a quiet act of hope, he tucks a few strands into the hem of his robe, the remnant. Finally, he cries out against the mountains of Israel, declaring that the high places of idolatry will be leveled. The city's heartbeat is failing because it stopped beating for its creator. The countdown has reached 0. In Ezekiel 7, the prophet rings the alarm. The end has come. Silver and gold are tossed into the streets like refuse, powerless to buy a way out of the coming storm. Suddenly, Ezekiel is seized by a lock of his hair, a divine transport, and dropped into the inner courts of the Jerusalem temple. What he sees is a chamber of horrors. Behind secret walls, elders offer incense to crawling things, women wail for the god Tammuz, and men turn their backs on the altar to worship the sun. The spiritual rot is absolute. Consequently, the glory of God begins to move, hovering painfully at the threshold, preparing to leave his house. But before the executioners strike, a man in linen moves through the city with a writing kit. He marks the foreheads of those who sigh and groan over the city's sins. Amidst the collapse, God identifies the remnant whose hearts are still tethered to him. The sky above Jerusalem crackles with the sound of wings and whirling wheels. In a chilling reversal of the temple's dedication, the glory of the Lord lifts from the threshold. It pauses over the cherubim, then moves to the mountain east of the city. God is leaving the building. But before the silence settles, he whispers a promise to the exiles. Though they are scattered, he will give them a heart of flesh to replace their hearts of stone. Back on the ground, Ezekiel is at it again. Under the cover of dusk, he packs a meager bag and digs a hole through a wall, crawling out with his face covered. He is a living trailer for a movie no one wants to see, the final deportation of the king and his people. To those mocking that the days are long and visions fail, the message is blunt. The time for procrastination has expired. The baggage is packed, the wall is breached, and the glory has moved. Imagine a city trembling under siege while its spiritual experts busy themselves painting a crumbling wall. In Ezekiel 13, false prophets are the decorators, slapping whitewash over deep structural cracks and shouting peace. Where there is only peril, God isn't fooled. He promises a torrential rain and hailstones to expose the mud beneath the paint. But the rot is deeper than masonry. In chapter 14, elders sit before Ezekiel, their faces pious, but their hearts crowded with stumbling blocks of iniquity. God warns that even the collective righteousness of legendary giants like Noah, Daniel, or Job couldn't shield a nation that has replaced its creator with idols. Finally, the metaphor turns to nature in chapter 15. Jerusalem is compared to a vine branch. A vine is prized for its fruit, but its wood is notoriously useless. It's too soft to be a tent peg and only fit for the fire. Charred at both ends and scorched in the middle, the vine of Jerusalem has lost its utility. Without the fruit of faithfulness, the branch is merely fuel. In Ezekiel 16, the prophet delivers a gut-wrenching allegory. Jerusalem was once an abandoned infant left to die in a field. Rescued and adorned by a king, only to trade her crown for the beds of strangers. It's a story of scandalous grace met with shocking betrayal. The scene then shifts to the high-stakes world of the two eagles. A great eagle, Babylon, plants a vine, but the vine foolishly twists toward another eagle, Egypt. God's message is clear. You cannot bypass a divine covenant with clever political schemes. The climax comes in chapter 18, where God dismantles the ultimate blame game. The people had a cynical proverb: the parents eat sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. They blamed their ancestors for their current misery. God shuts the door on excuses, declaring that every soul stands alone before Him. The cycle of generational baggage can be broken. The son is not a prisoner to the father's failures. His invitation is a radical reset: repent and live. The air grows heavy with a funeral dirge. Ezekiel weeps over a lioness whose cubs, Israel's princes, were captured and led away in cages. He sees a once lush vine, formerly towering with fruit, now uprooted in fury and transplanted into a parched desert. When the elders arrive, seeking a quick word from God, the response is a stinging history lesson: centuries of divine rescue met with persistent rebellion. God refuses to be consulted by those who still harbor the stench of idols. Then comes the flash of steel. God sings a terrifying song of the sword, a blade sharpened, polished, and handed to the executioner. We see the king of Babylon standing at a literal fork in the road, shaking arrows and consulting a liver to decide his path. Though the king uses pagan magic, the divine hand guides the blade toward Jerusalem. The crown is stripped, the ruins are many, and the message is haunting. God's patience is vast, but it is not infinite. Jerusalem has become a bloody city, and in chapter 22, God reveals the state of its soul. It is no longer silver, but foul dross. He throws the city into a divine furnace, searching for just one person to stand in the gap and pray for the land, but the breach remains empty. The narrative darkens in chapter 23, with the allegory of Ohala and Oholibah, two sisters representing Samaria and Jerusalem. They traded their divine covenant for political flings with Assyria and Babylon. In a tragic twist of irony, the very lovers they courted eventually turn into their conquerors. Finally, chapter 24 marks the point of no return. Ezekiel boils a pot of meat until the very bones are charred, symbolizing the city under siege. Then comes the ultimate cost: Ezekiel's wife, the desire of his eyes, dies. Forbidden to mourn, Ezekiel becomes a walking silhouette of the nation's impending grief. Their sanctuary, their pride, is gone, and the prophet falls into a heavy, waiting silence. As Jerusalem smolders, her neighbors, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia, erupt in a cruel standing ovation. They mock the sanctuary's ruin. But Ezekiel warns that their clap and stomp of celebration will soon turn to a cry for mercy as the same desert winds sweep over them. The gaze then shifts to the glittering merchant hub of Tyre. In chapter 26, the city gloats over Jerusalem's broken gates, hoping to profit from the trade collapse. God's response is a promise to scrape Tyre bare, like a sun-bleached rock where fishermen dry their nets. Chapter 27 serves as a haunting funeral song, picturing Tyre as a majestic merchant ship. Its masts were Lebanon cedar and its sails Egyptian linen, laden with ivory, gold, and fine fabrics. It was a floating superpower of global commerce. But the east wind of divine justice strikes. The magnificent vessel, heavy with pride, shatters in the heart of the seas. The world's economy trembles as the invincible ship sinks, proving that no amount of wealth can buy security when the soul is bankrupt. The prince of Tyre stood atop his island fortress, draped in jewels, whispering, "I am a god." But Ezekiel's voice cuts through the salt air. "You are but a man, and your heart has grown proud." Chapter 28 pulls back the curtain on a king who felt like a guardian cherub in Eden, adorned with every precious stone, only to be cast down for the corruption of his trade and the violence of his ego. From the sea to the river, the lens shifts to Egypt. Pharaoh lies in the Nile like a monstrous crocodile, boasting, "The river is mine. I made it for myself." God responds with a hook to the jaw. Egypt, the staff of reed that snapped and pierced Israel's hand when they leaned on it, is sentenced to desolation. Chapters 29 and 30 see the day of the Lord descend upon the ancient superpower. The arms of Pharaoh are shattered, while the arms of Babylon's king are strengthened to wield the divine sword. Whether an island merchant or a river king, the message is singular: God alone is the source of power. Imagine a cedar so tall, its canopy brushed the clouds. This was the great tree of chapter 31, an allegory for Egypt's staggering pride. Its roots drank from the deep, and its branches shaded every nation. But because it grew arrogant, the axe of judgment fell. The crash shook the earth as it was dragged down to Sheol, a reminder that no top-tier status is permanent. The lamentation continues. Egypt is no longer a majestic tree but a monster of the seas caught in a divine net. The graveyard of empires expands. Assyria, Elam and Edom all lie in the dust. Their terror in the land of the living now, a silent memory. Then, the tone shifts from the pit to the wall. Ezekiel is reminded of his role as a watchman. His duty isn't to save people, but to blow the trumpet of warning. If he stays silent, he is liable. If he warns and they ignore him, they are responsible for their own end. Finally, the crushing news arrives. The city has fallen. The time for warnings is over. The time for individual heart-searching has begun. The landscape of Israel is littered with abandoned sheep, scattered because their shepherds preferred feasting to protecting. In chapter 34, God fires the hirelings. I myself will search for my sheep, he declares, promising lush pastures and a prince of peace. The scene shifts in chapter 35 to the jagged peaks of Mount Seir. Edom, who gloated over Israel's fall, is silenced. Pride has a short shelf life. But the true climax happens in chapter 36. God isn't just fixing the borders, he's fixing the people. He looks at a nation of stony hearts, cold, unresponsive, and dead, and performs a divine transplant. He promises to sprinkle clean water, and replace that granite interior with a heart of flesh, pulsing with his spirit. This isn't a reward for their good behavior. It's a rescue for his reputation. The mountains of Israel, once desolate, begin to bloom again, proving that restoration starts from the inside out. Ezekiel stands in a graveyard of a nation. It's not just death, it's dryness. Hope is bleached white by years of exile. Can these bones live? God asks. Then, a rattle. Sinews stretch, skin covers, but the bodies remain still until Ezekiel calls to the four winds. The breath of God surges, performing divine CPR, and a vast army stands where there was only dust. Unity follows as Ezekiel binds two sticks, northern and southern kingdoms, into one unbroken scepter, but the peace is soon challenged. From the far reaches of the north, Gog and Magog descend like a storm cloud, a coalition of chaos intent on easy prey. This is the final showdown of the old world. God doesn't just defend, he overwhelms, turning the weapons of war into fuel for a 7-year fire. The message is clear. Even when the situation is bleached bone dry, the Spirit can resurrect a future that no enemy can dismantle. The exile felt like an eternity, but on a high mountain, the blueprints of hope begin to unfold. Ezekiel meets a man whose skin gleams like polished bronze, clutching a measuring rod. This isn't a dream of vague clouds, it's a vision of stone, symmetry, and shocking precision. From chapter 40 through 42, we walk through the gates east, north and south, each one measured to the last cubit. Every alcove, portico, and chamber is accounted for. Why the obsession with dimensions? Because details matter when holiness is moving back in. As the bronze man paces out the outer courts and the inner sanctuaries, the message is clear. God's dwelling is not a haphazard afterthought. It is a structured reality designed to separate the sacred from the common. After decades of a ruined Jerusalem, these rhythmic measurements serve as a heartbeat of restoration. This isn't just a building. It's a boundary where the divine meets the dust, prepared with infinite care for a people who thought they were forgotten. The air vibrates with the sound of rushing waters. Ezekiel watches from the threshold as the lightning brightness of God's glory, which he last saw departing Jerusalem years ago, now surges back through the eastern gate. The temple isn't just an empty monument anymore, it's a home. This is the place of my throne, the voice thunders. But with the presence comes a new standard. The eastern gate is bolted shut, a permanent reserved sign, because the king has entered. Chapter 44 draws a line in the sand for leadership. Only the faithful Zadokite priests, who didn't drift when the nation did, may approach the inner sanctuary. Finally, chapter 45 shifts from the altar to the marketplace. God demands honest scales and fair weights. The land is carved out with precision, ensuring the prince has his share so he no longer needs to oppress the people. Holiness here isn't a vague feeling. It's a structural reality that bleeds into the economy, the boundaries, and the very soil of the land. The tour concludes with a miracle. From the temple threshold, a trickle of water seeps out, flowing toward the sun. Ezekiel follows his guide as the stream becomes an ankle-deep brook, then a waist-high river, until it is a torrent too deep to cross. This isn't ordinary water, it's a liquid revolution. Wherever it touches the scorched earth, life erupts. It hits the Dead Sea, the salt-choked graveyard of the desert, and turns it fresh. Trees line the banks, bearing fruit monthly and leaves that heal the broken. In chapter 48, the map is redrawn. The land is no longer a source of conflict but an inheritance distributed with divine equity. Every tribe has a place, and the sanctuary sits at the heart of it all. But the grandest reveal isn't the architecture or the acreage, it's the city's new name. It is no longer just Jerusalem, but Jehovah Shammah. The book that began with a terrifying whirlwind of judgment ends with a quiet, permanent promise: the Lord is there.
Subscribe.